So welcome everyone. Welcome to the very last talk of this academic year, of this semester before the summer starts. And today I'm very happy that we have Chris Strelluf giving a talk on Donald Trump's speech. The title of his talk is Donald Trump has lowered thought for 5 decades. There's also a subtitle, but I will let Chris take care of that. And before I let Chris tell us all about Donald Trump and his vowels and his thought lowering, I will very briefly introduce Chris. Chris works as associate professor in applied linguistics at the University of Warwick. Those of you who know the British Association of Academic Phoneticians might know that Chris is the organizer of the next colloquium. So in 2 years, you can see Chris in his home environment. And Chris is a sociolinguist, a sociophonetician. Chris has worked on varieties of English. Chris has published lots of journal publications, book chapters, also books. And I'm going to share a link to some of Chris's books. I was particularly drawn to the Routledge Handbook of Sociophonetics. I thought that's something I must have a look at. But there are also books written by Chris on the origins of Missouri English, speaking from the heartland, and also actually Chris is a fellow in the Warwick Institute of Engagement. So Chris, part of your work is also bridging the gap between the world of academia and the world outside of academia, which I think is very cool. But now I'll stop talking so that we can hear from you.
Thank you. That was very kind of you. And thank you to everybody for being so generous to share your time. June always seems like a good time of the year until you get into it, and then it's really chaotic. So I appreciate you giving some of it to this session. This is a co-authored project by a little consortium we have here at Warwick called the Sociophonetics Reading Group. This is me and some doctoral students and a few undergrads. So Eamon, Shinran, and Shala are all doctoral students who I hope you will see professionally soon. And Sophie and Holly are undergrads. And our interest in lifespan change and Donald Trump kind of coalesced out of the readings that we were doing as we were meeting in this context. I'm really grateful to you for listening to this. This is the first kind of public out loud talking through the ideas that we're developing. So I thank you for your patience where we're still kind of figuring out what things mean, and also really will appreciate learning from you where we can think better about these things. We will talk through a large corpus that we've assembled of publicly available speech by Donald Trump, with the earliest recording being from 1980 when he was about 33, and the most recent being from 2023 when he was 77. We'll look today at 6 vowels that have been shown to be changing in New York City English in apparent time from their characteristic vowel qualities that are associated with New York City English to qualities that are more indicative of supra-regional American Englishes, so vowel qualities of general American English. And we're going to consider this data through lenses of lifespan language change and third wave sociolinguistics, both to inform our findings and to try to suggest some ways that our findings contribute to knowledge in these areas. A warning, as I've written this today, it's kind of disproportionately heavy in the background stuff on lifespan language change, public figures in this space in New York City English. There are results. I will get to them and I won't spend as long on them. So apologies for that. The background isn't maybe the most exciting part, but our results are actually quite clean and straightforward, I think, and they take on meaning in the context of these bigger issues in lifespan language change and in third wave perspectives. So Trump's an interesting guy to look at, and divorced of anything else, he's interesting in the context of lifespan language change because he has publicly navigated a ridiculous range of personae and identities. So obviously real estate mogul, reality TV star, president, more recently convicted felon, and these navigated personalities are an interesting thing to see how they're playing out. And also, again, just from an objective standpoint, Trump has, across these different identities, maintained a huge range of contacts in the United States and globally. So to the extent that lifespan language change is reflective of our accent to language inputs, we might see some stuff going on with him. Trump is also interesting because he seems to draw actively on language as a way to construct his personae. So this is recently written by Kjell Christensen, that Trump uses language to align his speech with the populist politics he's trying to project, and to align his elite socioeconomic status with the blue collar appeals he's trying to project. Many of these personae have been centered on his relationship to New York City, which I'll talk to. New York City is itself, and Trump's characteristically New York City speech is socially salient. I'm quoting from a quote that Kjell Christensen takes from a newspaper article. This is a kind of man on the street interview. And she says, "I don't care if he's in a plane with 24 karat gold. He talks like us. He gets us. He's a guy from Queens who's not too big for his britches." So we know he's using accent in these, or he seems to be using language, at least in agentive ways, and his accent matters. And on top of this, the personae that he project often depend on projections of inflexibility. So he's a negotiator, he's tough, he's going to build a wall, and when he says he's going to build a wall, he means he's going to build a wall. And this creates an interesting dynamic about how it might shape susceptibility and openness to lifespan language change. So these are some of our motivations in taking this particular data set on. Of course, time is central to sociolinguistics, and the default model has always been apparent time. But from the start of Lebov's positioning of apparent time as a way to study language change diachronically through a synchronic snapshot, he has pointed to the need for real-time studies as a way to rule out other sorts of changes that a couple of people who are on this call have called our attention to in the case of age grading, at least. These apparent time studies have finally and more recently increasingly been complemented by studies of lifespan change that are able to look at language change in real time, either by literally in real time analyzing data from the same speakers at different points in their lives, or by doing panel studies, so by studying characteristically similar people at different points in time. Broadly, these studies have confirmed and validated the basic assumptions of the apparent time model, that what we find through looking at apparent time based on the idea that people are fairly fixed in their language system after they complete the critical period of acquisition. Basically, that's a sound finding. But to some extent, some speakers, for some language users rather, for some linguistic variables, do retain abilities to some extent to adjust aspects of their language system well beyond the critical period and into adulthood. Sankoff gives a couple of reasons for the growing interest in lifespan change. One of these is the need to validate apparent time studies. One is pragmatically, and this will be a theme that you hear again, that there is increasingly a lot of data available that we can now use to study lifespan language change, which wasn't available to earlier generations of sociolinguists. And then phoneticians or sociolinguists who are more aligned to phonetics also point to the need to study lifespan change so that we can disentangle when changes are sociolinguistically motivated and when they're simply motivations of physiological changes related to age. In the case, especially of changes in F0. So we see this highlighted in the graph where we have a study of Queen Elizabeth II's speech and presenter Alistair Cook's speech. And we have F0 across lifespans for each of these speakers over time in the lower graph, and in the upper graph, we have F1. And we see regular patterns, at least for Queen Elizabeth, of changes in F0, and then a pattern that's often seen for men where there's F0 lowering for a while and then a tick up at some other point in life. And then what's really important here is that F1 seems to be to some extent coupled to this. So understanding the physiological changes that can lead to language change are critical for also understanding which changes we might see in speakers are not sociolinguistically motivated. Laurel McKenzie also points out that cognitive changes due to our exposure to language can cause us to calculate words and what phonological rules we apply at different rates. So our storage of language can also change over time. So these are some of the appeals to studying lifespan change. And because of the availability of their data, public figures have unwittingly become central to our study of lifespan change. So as you know, as it happens, if you're famous, that you will be recorded at multiple points in your life. And if that speech is available, then it's useful to study. So a lot of our knowledge about lifespan language change has come from studies of public figures. And of course, we're trying to contribute to that literature with this study. Schopp, Lefebvre, and Singler do acknowledge that public figures' linguistic practices may not be generalizable because public figures are different from the rest of us. On the other hand, though, from a sociolinguistic perspective, from say a first or second wave orientation, public figures can be convenient because some of the macro level or network information about them might be readily apparent in ways that it's not for us normal folks, things like changes in profession or changes in where they live or their social network. And from a more third wave perspective, public figures may be participating in the construction and projection of identities and might do so in different ways that make them available for examining how they're trying to draw differently at different times from socio-indexicalities and the socio-indexical fields. For this same sort of reason that public figures may be doing public work to construct identities, public figures and politicians in particular have also been of interest to third wave sociolinguistics to examine how affiliations and attitudes towards social issues might correlate with participation in linguistic change. So there have been a number of studies, especially of US politicians and Spanish politicians, examining synchronically how sociolinguistic variation might be linked to political orientation or political affiliation, with complicated results that I won't go into here, but I'm happy to talk to and will allude to as I go further. And then finally, the study of Canadian Governor General Michel Jean points to the possibility for combining these studies of political identity work with lifespan language change work, as Jean went from being a journalist and presenter to a politician and ultimately to a diplomat. And it was found that over time, through each of these career changes, as she moved into more political roles, she participated more in vowel qualities of her high vowels, consistent with Quebec French as opposed to international French. So it's suggested that her career changes show an orientation to French in different ways, and that manifested itself in her vowel system in using vowel qualities that were more characteristic of Quebec French. So that allows us to put together lifespan change, political figures, third wave identity projections. And a number of studies have started to do this, but it's important to acknowledge that when they've done this, there's been a lot of messiness in the results. So as an example of this, Schopp, Lefebvre, and Singler's brief case study of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg looked at her pronunciations of two stereotypically New York City English phonetic features: a raised aw vowel, what I'll call thought throughout this presentation, and R-lessness, a deleted R. I'll say more about these later. But they looked at Ginsburg's productions when presenting to the Supreme Court as an attorney in the 1970s and compared these to her pronunciations as a Supreme Court justice in the 2000s. And for both features, they found that she used the characteristically New York pronunciations more as a Supreme Court justice in the 2000s than she had as an attorney in the 1970s. Now, the processing here is what I really want to call attention to, because for the thought vowel, they suggested that in the 1970s, she needed to position herself as credible in front of the male-dominated and likely anti-Semitic Supreme Court. And so she couldn't use the New York City feature. But then as a Supreme Court justice, she is the person in charge, so she can talk however she wants. For our deletion, they offer two competing explanations of her R-lessness as a Supreme Court justice. The first basically mirrors what they suggested for the thought vowel, which is she doesn't need to worry about how she talks anymore because she's powerful. The second is they suggest that it might be the case that because because being older is devalued in the United States, it may be that as she ages, she realizes her language is valued less, so she worries less about how she says words. And what's crucial to point out here is that these are, as the authors acknowledge, equally compelling explanations, but they're totally mutually exclusive to each other. So we have totally contradictory explanations for how her identity might be constructed and projected through these phonetic features, but not a good way to resolve which one is actually happening here. I'll also suggest kind of similar interpretive problems with Chang's study of lifespan change of YouTube influencers. So Chang looked at two YouTubers, Nick and Jess, who had both relocated to the Western United States from other parts of the country, and predicted that they would adopt a Western US vowel system as part of their move and as part of their projection of identities to their audiences on YouTube. Cheng found that neither one did that, and then interpreted that as reasons that they really were trying to do identity work, but it was different identity work than just projecting themselves as being local to the Western United States. That explanation is compelling and aligns, is a reasonable interpretation of the data. But being critical of it, another reading of that is, I predicted these things would happen because they were trying to appeal to their audience. These things didn't happen, and that's because they were trying to appeal to their audience. So critically, if we don't start out with the assumption that people are doing identity work with their lifespan language change, then we might just conclude that they hadn't changed their language rather than that they were doing identity work. So this is all to say, this is an exciting space, an interesting space to work in, to put lifespan language change and third wave sociolinguistics together. But the results so far have been messy, and they bear criticism and critical reflection as we continue to engage in this sort of work. So we turn to the Donald and start out by talking through briefly what his New York City accent is. And importantly, the New York City English is highly socially salient and traditionally highly distinctive. So some of the features that are especially distinctive are raised thought vowels, so that words like bought, coffee, and dawn are pronounced more like bought, coffee, and dawn. And a split a vowel, where most American Englishes have a single lax trap vowel. New York City traditionally has a split between a tense vowel that we'll call bad and a lax vowel trap. And that's very complicatedly, phonetically, phonologically, lexically, and syntactically conditioned. And then there are other features like R-lessness and TH stopping and DH stopping. These are all highly socially salient, and this goes back to LeBeau's work in New York City English, that tense bad, raised thought are all associated with lower socioeconomic status. And these were the variants that gave rise to LeBeau's early positing of linguistic insecurity, because the speakers in New York who used these features the most rejected them and spoke worse of them. More recent work to attribute sociolinguistic evaluations by Becker has pointed to thought raising as being especially salient of white ethnicity in New York and being from the outer boroughs, including places like Queens, and indexing qualities like meanness and aloofness. And I will ask you just to keep that in the back of your mind for our subject as well. New York City English, though, seems to be in retreat. So this is shown really compellingly by Becker for the thought vowel. So thought is lowering in space or raising acoustically in apparent time. She puts the inflection point of thought lowering at 1946, which happens to be the year that Trump was born. The bad trap distinction is being lost in New York City. This is a complicated graph here, but it shows a move from a bad trap split to a more super regional nasal system that's characteristic of most North American Englishes. They put the inflection point for this in the 1950s, about a decade after Trump was born. They also find changes in the face vowel, with face beginning to raise, which they characterize as New York adopting a Philadelphia system for this vowel in particular. This doesn't seem to be socially salient in any of the literature that I'm familiar with. New Yorkers are also in apparent time beginning to front the to vowel. So this is the goose vowel in post-coronal positions. To lower the dress vowel, which is characteristic of many North American Englishes, and sometimes is part of a shift called the low back vowel merger shift, or the third shift, or the elsewhere shift, depending on who you're reading, as well as an emergence in New York City of allophonic separation of voiced and of pre-voiced and pre-voiceless allophones of price. So a distinction between prize in a voiced context and price in a pre-voiceless context, the American version of what's better known as Canadian raising. To put this a little bit more in spatial terms of vowel space, this is goose. I hope you can see my cursor here. Does my cursor come through? Thank you, Tanisha. Goose should be fronting in apparent time. Face is raising, dress is backing and lowering. Trap is backing and lowering, but more importantly, the bad split is disappearing, and so bad and trap aren't lexically or otherwise conditioned. Thought is no longer raised, but is lowering, and also pre-voiceless allophones of price are raising. To the extent that the consistent finding in lifespan language change studies is that speakers, to the extent that they change, will change in line with ongoing changes in the speech community around them. If Donald Trump was aligning to New York City English across his lifespan, we would see some degree potentially of goose fronting, face raising, dress lowering, bad lowering, or deleting the separation from trap, price raising, allophonic raising of price, and thought lowering. Because as it happens, as you may know, Donald Trump is from New York City. He spent all of his early life in New York at elite private schools. He was born in Queens, went to schools in and around New York City up through undergraduate, where he started at Fordham in the Bronx before leaving for University of Pennsylvania to do his master's degree. He inherited his father's New York City real estate business in 1973. In the 1980s and 1990s, he started building a national and international profile for himself, which was built on his reputation that he was cultivating and curating as a New York City real estate mogul and somebody who had saved the real estate market in New York City. And from this time, he's actively commenting on political issues from his expertise in tariffs and economic policy in the United States. In the 2000s, he went overtly into entertainment. He began hosting The Apprentice in 2004. The Apprentice, in all but one season, took place in New York. He lived in Trump Tower. Most seasons, the contestants all lived in Trump Tower, and many of the competitions they did were framed in New York City and often positioned as his experiences and his contacts and this sort of thing. So very much tied to his New York identity. And even into his presidency until 2019, he continued to live pretty extensively in Trump Tower, after which he changed his official residency. So this is to say, objectively, New York is part of Trump's background. And also, a lot of his personae have been tied to New York City. If the sound on this plays, I'll just give this as kind of a taster of this kind of identity work that he's doing with New York City. And this is from the intro to the first show of the first season of The Apprentice, to show that it's tied and he's tying himself to New York City.
New York, my city, where the wheels of the global economy never stop turning. a concrete metropolis of unparalleled strength and purpose that drives the business world. Manhattan is a tough place. This island is the real jungle. If you're not careful, it can chew you up and spit you out. But if you work hard, you can really hit it big. And I mean really big. My name's Donald Trump, and I'm the largest real estate developer in New York.
So the themes are here. You also hear the toughness, the competition, all that, but crucially it starts out with New York, and his expertise is based on his links to New York. Nope, almost played it again. If you are a big fan of The Apprentice, I might not be able to get off that slide. So this is our starting point. New York City English is a socially salient thing. It's a part of Trump's identity, but also a resource for him to use to draw on as he constructs identity. And certainly he plays on his relationship to New York City as part of his public identity projections. So we posit on the basis of this that when we look across the span of Donald Trump's life, we'll see potentially one of four things. So our first hypothesis is that Trump's language will change only in line with age-related changes in physiology, so there will be no sociolinguistic change. And no change beyond physiologically mandated things. Our second hypothesis is that Trump's vowels will change in line with ongoing changes in New York City English, which would be in the direction of supraregional vowel qualities. If we're interpreting this through an identity lens, this would be suggestive of trying to speak in a way that's more appropriate to a national audience. We're shifting away from some of the stigmatized associations of New York City English. The third possibility we suggest is that his vowels will become more characteristic of traditional New York City English. So in one sense, this would be kind of a retrograde change, but in an identity sense, this might be him actively drawing on New York City English as a resource to establish and project his identity. And then finally, we suggest a possibility that his vowels might not change at all, even in cases where you would expect them to, like lowering of F1, which could be coupled to natural lowering of F0 if that was happening. And in a sense, no change isn't often positioned as change, but or as interesting, but this could be potentially consistent with a person projecting an identity of intransigence and being tough and being inflexible to social change. So we want to have this hypothesis in front of us as well. We examine his vowels through the tried and true method of single point measurements of the first two formants in the spectrogram. So correlating the first formant with vowel height and the second formant with vowel frontness, and using the single formant measurements as an estimate of vowel quality over time. We assembled a very large corpus, and one of our goals here, one of our interests, was to see how quickly we could assemble a very large corpus to use to investigate linguistic features. This is my attempt to visualize a methods section. But we scraped a total of 70 speech events, again, from 1980 to 2023, basically every publicly available speech event we could find from YouTube and Bilibili. This includes news interviews, both political and entertainment, books on tape that he narrated, political speeches, the entire first season of The Apprentice in 2004, phone calls from Bob Woodward's interviews, and campaign speeches and other political things from his time before and after the presidency. We used automatic speech recognition to diarize the speech signals to pick out who the speakers in a speech signal were, and then Whisper AI to automatically transcribe. We took the ASR generated transcripts and sound files and put them in Elan, and then manually corrected and identified which speaker was Trump. Then used Montreal Forced Aligner to align, fave extract to take single point measurements. That initially left us with over 200,000 vowels to work from. For quality control, we removed the stop words, focused on vowels in primary stress, excluded 2 key outliers, used Labanov to normalize. I won't talk about that now, but I will say more about implications of that once we get to discussion. We focus on the 6 vowels that Haddocken et al. Examined for apparent time change in New York City English in general. We checked all the trap bad words that are sort of marginal for different New Yorkers to code his system and to make sure that we had a good coding of his trap bad split. And then for this presentation, we focus on vowels in pre-obstruent contexts as the ones that are measured best by fade. And that gives us for this data set a total of about almost 34,000 vowels to work from, including over 24,000 in the main 6 vowels that Haddocken et al. Look at. So that's the background. Now finally, some results. This chart includes the 6 vowels that we were interested in from Haddocken et al. So that's dress, bad, face, to, the fronted goose, thought, and the pre-voiceless allophones of price. We also have fleece, cool, trap, and lot as reference points for vowel space. And then also we use trap for some of our analysis. This is an attempt to capture all that we see across the entire data set in one snapshot. So lighter colors are a mean calculated from an Elmer mixed effects regression with the speech event as a random intercept. And then as you get darker, you get up toward the 2020s. And then, of course, all the vowels here, they have the different symbols. So you can try to understand that this is all the same vowel. The observations from this. First, there isn't anything that's consistently going on with all the vowels. So we don't see, say, all the vowels raising in F1, lowering in vowel space, or everything fronting. So we don't see anything systematic that's happening in the vowel set. So that's important for establishing that if something is happening, it might just be happening for one vowel rather than be an artifact of the data that we collected. More analytically, what you see is, again, we're looking for to fronting, face raising, bad lowering, dress lowering and backing, maybe trap lowering and backing, though I won't say much about that, price raising and thought lowering. And for the most part, none of this happens. So to does not front at all. It stays almost identically at F2 where it is for the entire lifespan. Face does not raise at all or really change. Dress does not lower in a consistent way. Price does not raise in a consistent way. So for these 6 changes, or for these 4 sound changes that are ongoing in New York City English today, we don't observe any change. Potentially, we see a possibility of bad lowering from the earliest point in the sample, the 1980s, to later points. I'll look at this in a bit more detail later. Where we do see a pretty consistent pattern is in thought lowering. So the title's not just an accident. There actually is a justification for that. We see a unidirectional pattern of lowering that's consistent with the ongoing sound change in New York City English, away from the traditional pronunciation of New York City English and in the direction of supra-American Englishes. This looks at each speech event. So each speech event is calculated from an Elmer regression, and then these are plotted in time. The regression lines that we've drawn through the low S curves are not statistically meaningful. It's just to pick out trends. We did run conditional inference trees on these data sets to see if there were significant breaks. And where a tree predicted any, we plotted those in dashed lines. So you can see where those are, but we'll need to clarify some of those. Starting point for this is that the low S regressions for to, dress, price, and face, the ones that didn't seem to be changing here, are effectively flat. There is some variation in some of these, the peak around the apprentice and face, and then a peak later in time. But if we look at the overall range of variation at any point in the sample, there hasn't really been change in how much variability there have been across pronunciations, across time. And really where there are breaks in the data, it seems to be more down to imbalances in the data set and some spaces where, say here, there's a few extra low productions in face. So really confirming that we don't see anything happening with to, dress, price, and face. Bad, again, probably not anything happening, but certainly in the earlier years, there is a pattern at least of a lowering in backing quality, a reduction in diagonal, which is a combination of height and frontness in a single measure, F2 minus F1. So again, potentially some evidence of bad lowering in the direction of broader regional American Englishes. Thought is again a more consistent pattern. So not only do we have a consistent pattern in this line, what I really point to is that the lowest values on this chart are lowest in terms of F1, so highest in vowel space. And at the start of our sample in the 80s and 90s, almost all of his pronunciations are fairly low in this chart, so low F1. And toward the end of his sample, they're consistently higher F1, lower in vowel space. So this really, validates, I think, what we saw in the plot with vowel space. We take a little bit more nuanced look here at Bath and Trap, or excuse me, Bad and Trap. Because bad and trap in New York City English are not just characterized by the raised quality of bad, but also by how much overlap there is with trap. So it's also possible that Trump wouldn't have changed the vowel quality of bad, but might have gotten rid of the separation between bad and trap. So here we try to examine, well, if bad doesn't clearly lower, maybe bad and trap are pronounced in the same vowel space over time. And we measure that with Bhattacharya's coefficient as a measuring overlap. This is a similar measure to Pillai's trace. But I like it better for reasons that aren't interesting to people besides me. And so an increase in Bhattacharya's coefficient would correspond to an increase in overlap between bad and trap, which would be suggestive of getting rid of the New York City bad trap split. And we do see, again, a little bit of a trend of increasing overlap between bad and trap. So some evidence suggestive of getting rid of that split. And the conditional inference tree picks out 2004. So the time of his move from the apprentice is the last data point contained in 2004. His entry into politics is characterized by more overlap in speech events. So our summary, and again, I'm sorry that the results are such a tiny part of this, but the summary of these results is that there's very limited evidence of lifespan change across most of the vowels that are undergoing change in New York City English, at least in Haddock et al.'s 2022 study. There's almost no change appreciably in dress, face, trap, price, and two, Trump is not following the trends in general American English or in New York City English around him. We have a very qualified finding that maybe there was a reduction in bad raising or a reduction in the use of the New York City English bad trap split. And to the extent that that occurred, it does happen that it occurred as Trump was moving into national celebrity. We have a pretty clear pattern in our interpretation of Trump lowering thought across his lifespan. So shifting his thought away from that highly salient New York City English pronunciation of thought toward the pattern in general American English. Our processing of this in terms of our hypotheses is so I'll go back to normalization. We chose to normalize the data because we were taking speech from so many different media and used normalization as a way to screen out differences in how things were recorded that might have shown up in our data. A problem with that is that really limits our ability to investigate lifespan change. If Trump had a regular pattern of F0 lowering, then we'd expect just all of his vowels to stay in the same place. I think we can rule out hypothesis one because there was change in some of his vowels. The fact that thought changed and maybe to some extent bad changed, allows us to say there were changes beyond just what was happening physiologically. We can categorically rule out the third hypothesis. Trump does not speak in a way more characteristic of New York City English, despite the work that we would think ostensibly he might be doing to project a New York City identity in other contexts. The other two areas are a bit more interesting. So one of these is, it would be nice to say, and perhaps the reason for Trump's resistance to some of the changes like to, fronting, dress lowering, face raising, price raising, is that perhaps this is him indexing resistance to changes and being intransigent. But that's problematized by the fact that he does lower thought and he does lower bad. So he does seem to be adopting some super-regional vowel qualities, despite the fact that these would seem to be contrary to the identity he's projecting, the persona that he's constructing. What's really striking about these two vowels that do change in quality across his lifespan is that these two precisely are the ones that were both starting to undergo change while Trump was a child and were sociolinguistically stigmatized when Trump was a child. Face raising also seemed to have been starting in Haddocken et al.'s apparent time study when Trump was a child, but we're not aware in any of the literature of any stigma attached to face raising. So in other words, it seems like, and I think our interpretation of this data is, Trump is not actively participating in sound change, but for specifically those vowel qualities that were changing when he was in his critical acquisition period and were sociolinguistically stigmatized during his critical acquisition period, he sort of gets pulled along the tide of sound change. We think there are implications for this to our knowledge of plasticity of the language faculty and for work to attribute motivations to lifespan language change. In terms of the plasticity, one of the findings that Harrington and colleagues point to in their studies of public figures is that if public figures like Queen Elizabeth are participating in social sound change as part of their lifespan, when there's so much pressure on them to talk and when their identities are fairly sheltered, then the rest of us must be as well. We think we can take this even farther with Trump because we have a case of a person who's actively constructing a persona of being intransigent, of trying to align with the city. And if even for that person, the vowel qualities that were sociolinguistically marked and undergoing change when they were a child, they still participate in those changes, then we think that suggests that very few of us can resist participating in these sound changes. So we think that Trump suggests that sort of the position that the public figures show us that all of us must be participating in sound change. We think it dramatically underlines that fact. Second, we suggest that our findings and the complicatedness of the identity work that Trump may or may not be doing in this points toward kind of a need to be cautious about how we interpret identity work taking place in lifespan language change. If we had only looked at the thought vowel or the bad vowel, we would reach a different conclusion than what we reached by looking at a broader system. And of course, we had only looked at the to vowel or the price vowel, we would reach a different conclusion from what we reach for thought. And so for one thing, when looking for identity work going on in lifespan language change, we think this points to the need to look systematically across multiple language features, because we might want to see identity work and it might show up in one variable, but a broader set of variables will point us in different directions. We also think it's really important to point to the intransigence of the different identity-based attributions of change that we're suggesting, and that by reaching the conclusion that the most plausible explanation is, as part of his critical language acquisition period, Trump inherited that these vowels were changing and inherited these sociolinguistic evaluations that were in the speech community, and that may be manifesting itself in lifespan language change. We think it's really important to not want to see identity work in our data when other explanations are potentially available. So reminding ourselves when looking at data through a third wave perspective, that the fundamental assumption, the fundamental premise of empirical research must be that variation is random And we have to prove variation is random before we don't. If we find ourselves with competing hypotheses, we may need to look to something that's not based on identity rather than reinterpreting our data to make sure that we can find a way that speakers are doing identity work through it. So we think those are some of the things that we found. I assume this is what Trump would look like if you made him read a list of references. There are 3 pages of references. And I am grateful for your thoughts, questions, and challenges to what we have so far. Thank you.